Hey guys, good morning. Welcome to Godly Play. I'm here in my living room and I'm going to miss seeing your beautiful faces, but we're going to have our story together this Easter morning. Okay, are you ready? We're going to listen with our heart and our ears and see what God has to say to us this morning. Today's story is about Jesus and Jerusalem, and also known as the Holy Week. This is a map of Jerusalem in the time of Jesus. It was already a very old city by that time. It's about 3,000 years old today or more. It's still a place for Christians, Muslims, and Jews to come and pray, and a place of pilgrimage. These are the walls of the city. This will represent the upper room at the south end of the city. This will be the fortress of Antonio, the Roman fortress. This is the place of the high priest Caiaphas. This will represent Herod's place. And this is the temple. These are stone walls around the temple. This will represent the Mount of Olives on the outskirts of the city. And these will represent the Garden of Gethsemane. This will represent Golgotha, also called the place of the skull, where Jesus was crucified. And this represents where Jesus was buried, a tomb given to him by Joseph of Arimathea. About 1,000 years before Jesus came, King David took this city over to make it his own. It was his son Solomon that built this temple, the original one. The Babylonians came in and destroyed the temple and took people into exile. When they came back, the temple was rebuilt and then expanded and rebuilt once more by Herod. Jesus came to Jerusalem many times throughout his life, but this story is about the last time that Jesus came to the great city. Jesus and his disciples were traveling along the winding River Jordan. He had just healed the blind man Bartimaeus, and he had lunch with Zacchaeus. Now they probably spent the night in Bethany, the Sabbath, and rested. Sunday morning, they continued traveling into the city, and they climbed up the limestone slabs and entered the city through the south gate. Before they got to the south gate, Jesus had sent 2 of the disciples ahead to go get a donkey. He said exactly where the donkey would be tied and that no one would ask, that it would be fine. The disciples said, "Are you sure, Lord? Are they going to just take that donkey?" Jesus reassured them. So that they did go ahead and they brought that donkey back. And nobody did ask. Jesus rode that donkey in through the south gate into the city. They took the oldest routes through the city, the pilgrim streets. As they came through and Jesus was on the donkey, people started to wave palm branches, saying, "Hosanna in the highest, blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord." There were many that believed Jesus could be the Messiah. Others placed down their cloaks and made a path for Jesus as he rode the donkey through the old city streets. People were gathering and following. There were some old wooden tables set up where people were selling things like bread or cheese or oils. They came to an open area, and that's where they left the donkey. And Jesus and his followers continued to the temple. They went inside and they prayed. When they were finished their prayers, they came back through the city, out the south gate, around the Kidron Valley, past the Garden of Gethsemane to the Mount of Olives. And that's where they spent their night. And that was Sunday. On Monday, Jesus again got up, went through the south gate, entered the city, and went straight to the temple to pray. He climbed up on the outer portion and he taught with the other rabbis. This part was called the Mount of the Gentiles. When Jesus was finished teaching and sharing about God's kingdom, he left the city again and returned to the Mount Olives. Tuesday, once again, he came in and around the Kidron Valley, through the south gate, and back to the temple, to his Father's place. This time, instead of just being on the Mount of the Gentiles and on the outside, he entered into the temple. Now, he couldn't go through the triple doors or the double doors. That was just for the high priest. But he did enter through the single door and went right through the back of the temple. The long hall, called the Royal Portico. At the back of the temple there was a marketplace. And Jesus saw many small animals in cages that people were selling for sacrifices. It was also where the Sanhedrins were found. When Jesus saw this marketplace going on in his Holy Father's house, he became upset. And he flipped those tables over and he reminded everyone that this was a place of prayer and worship, not a place of money exchange and market. And Jesus then left the temple. And crowds of people started to follow him. Each time he came, more and more people came to listen and watch to see what Jesus had to say. The Roman soldiers were becoming concerned. After his day, he once again went back to the Mount of Olives to spend the night. Wednesday morning came, and Jesus came back into the city. And the crowds were waiting for him and listening to see what he was going to say or do next. He continued to preach about the Lord's kingdom. The crowds grew and listened, and the Roman soldiers grew more and more concerned and upset that Jesus had so many followers. And they were starting to talk amongst one another. Could this be the Messiah? The one promised, coming from the Mount of Olives with a band of angels to shoo away the Roman soldiers? Jesus went back and once again spent the night with his disciples. But this night he sat up on the top of a hill so he could oversee the temple in Jerusalem. He sat there with Matthew and Mark, and James and Peter, and they were asking him, "Rabbi, what is going to happen?" And that was Wednesday. Thursday came, and all the Roman soldiers were expecting Jesus to show up at the temple. They were waiting for him, and they were ready. They were going to arrest Jesus. Now, Jesus did not show up at the temple at all that day. The disciples were saying to Jesus, "Where will we celebrate Passover, Lord?" And Jesus said, "Go into the city and you will see a man with a jug. He will show you exactly where we should have our Last Supper. He will show you how to get up in through the back to the upper room." So that evening, Jesus and his disciples all went back in through the city to the upper room. They climbed in the back and they were all together to have their last meal. They ate and ate until they had their fill, probably of bread and fish and fruit. And when dinner was over, Jesus took the bread and he broke it and he gave it to all his disciples. And then he took the cup and he did the same. And he passed it out to all the disciples. And he said to them, "I will always be with you, especially in this bread and in this cup." Now the disciples didn't completely understand what Jesus was saying, but they never forgot what he said. After that, he reminded them about the love of God and how they are to love one another the way he has shown and taught, and to be servants of both the Lord and of man. And with that, he got down on his knees and he washed all his disciples' feet. It was getting very late. At this time, Judas ran into the darkness of the city streets. And the others, Jesus and the other followers, went back to the Mount of Olives. It was very late, so the disciples grew tired and fell asleep. But Jesus was in the garden. He was in the Garden of Gethsemane, and he was praying and praying and praying. Soon, he saw a light in the distance, and he got up, and it was the Roman soldiers coming to take him. Judas was with them. They took Jesus away into the city and over to the Roman fortress of Antonia. It was late at night, so they took him to Caiaphas, the high priest. Caiaphas asked Jesus, "Who are you? Are you who they say you are? Who are you? Are you the king of the Jews?" Jesus was silent. Caiaphas became angry. He tore his robes in two, and he charged Jesus with blasphemy. Blasphemy, he said, which is the charge of pretending you are God. And with that, he sent him back to the fortress for the night. In the morning, they brought him before Pilate. And he also questioned Jesus and said, "Who are you? Are you the king of the Jews?" Jesus said, "They say that I am." And Pilate said many questions to Jesus, and Jesus stayed quiet. Pilate didn't know what to do. He saw nothing wrong with Jesus, so he sent him to King Herod. And again, Herod asked many questions. And Jesus stayed silent. So Herod sent him right back to Pontius. It was tradition on Passover to release one prisoner. So Pontius Pilate brought before the crowds of people both Jesus and a prisoner named Barabbas. And he asked the crowds, "Who shall I release, Jesus or Barabbas?" And they all yelled, "Barabbas, Barabbas, Barabbas. So Pontius released Barabbas, like the crowd asked. The Roman soldiers took Jesus to prepare him for his crucifixion. They did many terrible things to Jesus. And they took him outside the city walls while he carried a heavy olive tree cross. Crowds of people following, some wondering, is this truly the Messiah? They watched on as Jesus carried that cross all the way up to Golgotha, also called the place of the skull, where they crucified him and left him to die. They took his body down and they laid him in the tomb, and a huge, huge stone was placed in front of the tomb and locked it tight. And that was Friday. On Saturday, the world was still. Silence. Sunday morning, the women got up and just had to be with Jesus. So they ran over to where Jesus' tomb was. And when they got there, there was an angel. And the stone had been moved. And Jesus' body was missing. "Where has my Lord gone? Who has taken him?" they proclaimed. But it wasn't long after that they realized that Jesus was still with them in a new way. He had risen. And he was with them that day, just as he's with you and me always. And that's our Easter story. I wonder, what part of this story do you think is the most important part? I wonder what part of this story is about you and me. I wonder what part of this story we could leave out and still have all we need. Or could we? I wonder if this is the most important story ever told. And now I wonder what you guys are going to do at home with your families for your work time. You know how we follow it up with crafts or games or pictures or whatever you'd like to do. I would love for you to do something at home, like I said, with your families to reinforce this story and see what God spoke to you about, to your hearts. Hope you enjoyed your story. I miss you guys. Stay safe, stay healthy, and enjoy this time with your families. Happy Easter. Love you guys.